All right, very good. So, welcome everybody, and so good to see you all again, and to see especially those of you who stuck with us through the whole course. I know that it's hopefully something a bit different from ordinary courses that we can do on Buddhism. And for me, I feel a bit I always feel a bit nervous when starting these classes, because I'm always like, not sure if I actually know what I'm talking about. And so hopefully everything is going okay, and is sort of communicated in a really sane and comprehensible way. We have so far covered the bulk of Jayatilleka's book, The Early Buddhist Theory of Knowledge, and we done so in a fairly quick manner, skipping over large chunks of it and only on certain parts. And one of the things about Jayatilleka's style is that his style is somewhat fragmentary. He gives like, he has this overarching structure, but he gives like a lot of sort of different kind of atomic sort of theses or arguments and so on. And so it sometimes takes a while to sort of draw the thread of the argument together and try to figure out what it is exactly that he's talking about. And in addition to that, he frequently engages in extensive discussions of other scholars' works, which of course is a normal part of academic discourse, but it's a somewhat of dubious merit or dubious interest, especially long after everyone's forgotten who those other scholars are or hasn't read them. However, in these last couple of chapters of his book, he begins to draw together the threads that have been developed throughout the whole work. And so we're starting to see here what this is all about, why it matters, and we're starting to be able to actually draw some meaningful conclusions. And just skimming through the chapter in preparation for the class today, then one of the things I was struck with was by how familiar so many of ideas and arguments and points of view that Jayatilleka has. By familiar chapter, so the last two chapters, chapter 8 and chapter 9, that we'll be looking at we'll be drawing together a lot of the threads that we have opened up in the early chapters, and we're also dealing with a much smaller scope. So we're only doing one chapter per session. So hopefully there'll be more time for discussion. That was my idea, but it looks like there'll be more time for dropping in and out of Wi-Fi instead. So anyway, that's another kind of experience, I guess. So hopefully I'll be able to take it a little bit slower these last two sessions and have some more time for your questions. So this is the idea. So please do throw any questions and so on that you have in in the chat. So Nadine says, apologizes, she's being terrorized by her 4-year-old, hence this black square. Well, all I can say, Nadine, is that epistemologically speaking, that you are overcoming challenges in your search for knowledge that I have not had to face. So I only have respect for your perseverance. Okay. So let us proceed to chapter 8. And oh yes, that's right. I was talking about how many of the ideas and arguments that Jayatilleka uses are the same ones that I also have used, and nowhere is that more apt or more the case than in the beginning of chapter 8, where Jayatilleka discusses questions of rebirth. And these are questions that come up very, very frequently, and in particularly sort of often hotly argued within the context of so-called secular Buddhism. And some of you may recall that a number of years ago, I had a discussion here in Sydney with Stephen Batchelor on the topic of rebirth and presenting different perspectives on it. And you know, one of the, and this raises a lot of those kinds of issues about local authority and belief, and the relationship of the Buddhist tradition with the pre-Buddhist tradition. And I have believed for a long time, like just for the record, I think rebirth is true, but I also think that it's perfectly reasonable to doubt whether it's true. However, what I don't think is reasonable is to doubt whether the Buddha taught that it was true. So if you disagree with the Buddha, that's all right. There's no law saying you have to agree with the Buddha, but you know, don't try to pretend that he taught something that he didn't teach. And this is something the Buddha himself said a lot. Actually, you find in the suttas, if people had a different view than the Buddha, then the Buddha would just discuss it with them and see, you know, have a reasoned discussion. There wasn't any problem. But if you misrepresented the Buddha, if you said this is what the Buddha taught and it wasn't what he taught, then he would get very upset with you. Well, when I say upset, I don't know if he would feel upset, but he would certainly have some harsh words for you. Anyway, so let's have a look beginning at chapter 8, authority and reason. So this is divided into two parts. The first part on authority is dealing mostly with saddha and faith and the relationship between acceptance of faith, and the second with reason. So we'll begin with paragraph 622. In chapters 4 and 5, we discussed the attitude of Buddhism to authority and reason, respectively. The general conclusion was that neither could be trusted as giving us certain truth. The general context of the discussion, however, seemed to show that by authority here was meant mainly, if not solely, the authority of other religious traditions and persons than that of Buddhism. In this chapter, we propose to examine to what extent, if at all, this attitude to authority and reason is maintained within Buddhism. In this inquiry, we shall strictly confine ourselves to the Buddhism of the Pali Canon, for we feel that much of what has been said on this subject is vitiated by the fact that almost the entire field of Buddhism, the different schools, ancient and medieval, has been treated together with little regard for historical perspective. So here, Jatakas is making this distinction between early Buddhism and later Buddhism. He only looking at the context of the Pali Canon. Generally speaking, in research, you know, the ideal is that we look at early Buddhism within the context of the Pali, Chinese, Sanskrit, and Tibetan. And of course, that's what we established sort of central for. In terms of doctrinal discussions, for the most part, obviously the doctrines are the same in those different aspects. So anyway, Jatakas is confining himself to the Pali Canon. He goes on, we have to ask ourselves three questions in trying to elucidate the place of authority within Buddhism. First, does Buddhism or the Buddha uncritically accept any doctrines on authority from the prevalent traditions? Second, is the attitude recommended towards the authority of external traditions and persons the same as that expected towards the doctrines of Buddhism itself? Right? Very important question. Did the Buddha say, you know, you should be skeptical of those other guys, but when it comes to me, just believe everything I say? I mean, it's not an unusual kind of attitude. Thirdly, irrespective of the answer to the second question, do the disciples of the Buddha accept any doctrines on the authority of the Buddha? The answer to the first question on the part of scholars, that's the question of whether the Buddha uncritically accepted any doctrines on authority from the prevalent traditions. The answer to this question on the part of scholars has on the whole been in the affirmative. That is to say that there is a bunch of previous scholars who have argued that the Buddha did in fact accept doctrines on simply because they're available in the present prevalent tradition. He goes on to cite a number of authorities to that effect. According to Oldenburg, it is certain that Buddhism has acquired as an inheritance from Brahmanism not merely a series of its most important dogmas, but what is not less significant to the historian, the bent of its religious thought and feeling, which is more easily comprehended than expressed in words. Professor Rhys-Davids says that Gautama was born and brought up and lived and died a Hindu. There was not much in the metaphysics and principles of Gautama that could not be found in one or other of the orthodox systems. And again, the Buddhism grew and flourished within the field of orthodox belief. Radhakrishnan is of the same opinion. Early Buddhism is not an absolutely original doctrine. It is no freak in the evolution of Indian thought. All of these are, of course, quite outdated scholars by now. Radhakrishnan, of course, a Hindu scholar. Professor Rhys-Davids, interesting that Jayatilleka quotes Rhys-Davids saying that the Buddha was born, lived and died a Hindu, which is indeed a quote that Professor Rhys-Davids made. However, this actually came up in the relevant Wikipedia pages, where this is cited by Hindutva scholars quite frequently as evidence for the fact that the Buddha was a Hindu. And this is a highly politicized issue. For those of you who are not familiar with the background, in India, there is a large number of some millions of people who were traditionally called the outcast or the Dalit people, whose conversion to Buddhism following the lead of Dr. Ambedkar after the formation of the Indian state led to their social and emancipation. Basically, they became Buddhists to free themselves from slavery. And so the Hindutva position is always to try to drag them back and say, well, the Buddha was just a Hindu anyway. And this is still a very major thrust of thought in mainstream Indian thought. I'll give you a little anecdote to that effect. When Professor Gombrich was setting up the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies, Modi, the current Prime Minister's wife, this was many years ago, but before they were Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister's wife came and said, I hear that you're looking for funding for your project. We would be happy to fund the entire costs of your centre, several £1 million, and that won't be a problem. He said, oh, that's very kind of you. She said, there's only one thing. He said, yes, what's that? She said, you have to say that the Buddha was a Hindu. So that was the end of that little relationship. So this idea is still very, very mainstream, and it has very powerful political ramifications. It's not merely a religious or spiritual idea. So anyway, on Wikipedia, we frequently find quoted that Buddha, Rhys-Davids said the Buddha was born or died as a Hindu. What they don't notice, and which I'm a bit disappointed that Radhakrishnan, that Jayatilleka here doesn't notice, is that was one of Rhys-Davids' very early writings, and he later on repudiated that idea and wrote the exact opposite of it. And I think about 6 years later or 10 years later, he wrote that Hinduism didn't exist in the time of the Buddha. And that actually is the accepted historical situation as understood by historians today. What we know of as Hinduism evolved from the Vedism and Brahmanism, which was current in the time of the Buddha, but it didn't exist in the time of the Buddha. And we don't really know what the Buddha's family's religious background was, but there's no hint anywhere that it was Hindu, or presumably they followed whatever the local beliefs were in their place. Anyway, point being that various scholars have claimed that the Buddha was following what previous traditions said. Jayatilleka goes on, and that's right, and that point of view is also a point of view which is frequently argued by secular Buddhists, who will say the same thing. The Buddha accepted the doctrines of rebirth because that's what everyone believed. There is, Jayatilleka goes on, however, a difference between critical and uncritical acceptance of ideas prevalent at the time. And the above statements do not make very clear which was the case with Buddhism. So just moving on, I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs to paragraph 629. So that point about the critical and the uncritical acceptance of views, and this is crucial here. the Buddha was more than happy to accept and to draw from things that he found in the society around him. But he would only do so after reflection. And he would do so critically. If something was good and worthwhile, then he would accept it. And if it was not, then he would reject it. This is really critical. And this is one of the things which we find today in the dialogues around authority and knowledge and understanding. These days, people like to reject the evidence of experts. Experts don't know. Oh, that's just what the experts say, but they don't really know. And then there's always some conspiracy theory about how the experts are all biased, about how they're not looking at the facts correctly, and so on. And any view which starts out with a blithe dismissal of expert knowledge is not a view that should be taken seriously. It's an extreme point of view. At the same time, a view that says we should just accept whatever experts say without any consideration or criticism also is an extremist view, because nobody knows more than experts how their own knowledge and understanding is limited and what those limits might be. So the Buddha did the right thing, which was to engage with the views that he found around him at the time in a critical way. And he would accept them if they deserved to be accepted. Let's continue with paragraph 629. The only evidence adduced by those who put forward or suggest is that the Buddha uncritically accepted the idea of rebirth, is that rebirth is almost universally accepted in the Indian religious tradition. Since Buddhism too subscribes to this view, it is argued that Buddhism dogmatically accepted this theory from the prevalent tradition. From this, it follows that the Buddha himself was violating the very injunction that he was making when he asked people not to accept a doctrine merely because it was found in a tradition. Paragraph 630. With all deference to scholarship, he says, immediately signaling that he's not going to defer to scholarship at all, we wish to submit that this conclusion arises from both an unhistorical as well as an uncritical survey of the material. In fact, that a belief is found in a substratum A and in chronologically successive stratum B provides no conclusive evidence that the thinkers of stratum B uncritically and dogmatically accept it from the thinkers of stratum A. If we say so, it would follow that even a good scientist uncritically or dogmatically accepts the theories of his predecessors with whom he happens to agree, merely on the grounds of his agreement. And again, a point well made there, and a point that when we say that we can't sort of blithely believe everything that was on the basis of authority, it doesn't mean that we should be rejecting authority. Imagine what world we'd be living in if the starting point of science was to wipe the slate clean and reject all previous science and just build everything up from first principles. The progress of science would be very, very slow. Of course, we have to pass down knowledge from one generation to the next, but we do so critically. We don't do so uncritically. Now, okay, it goes on. Let us examine the credentials of the above widely accepted theory. In the first place, it is false to say, and so again, this widely accepted theory, I would say that these days, that theory is not widely accepted in Buddhist scholarship, and that the arguments that Jatakas is making here are well known, and I don't think that they would be really problematic within the context of knowledgeable Buddhist scholars. However, they are still very widespread in certain circles, especially from what I've seen in certain secular Buddhist circles. I don't want to sort of paint that with too broad a brush, because obviously within secular Buddhist circles, there's a variety of different people with different views. But in my experience, this kind of view has been said fairly commonly. In the first place, it is false to say that rebirth was universally accepted by the Indian religious tradition prior to the advent of Buddhism. It is false, okay? It is not the case that everybody believed in rebirth. It just isn't. There's no trace of a belief in rebirth in the Rig Veda. where we find only sporadic references to a belief in a life after death. Again, just to sort of slow down and take in the consequences of that, we have been conditioned from our understanding of Hinduism to assume that because the Hindus say that their teaching is an eternal doctrine that has never changed, that therefore this is the case. And because they teach rebirth, therefore they have always taught rebirth. But when we look into the scriptures maintained by the Hindu tradition, we find that actually the oldest scriptures in that tradition don't talk about rebirth at all. Incidentally, this is a very similar situation to what we find in the Bible, where many of the cardinal doctrines of the Christian faiths are in fact not found in the Bible itself or directly contradict them. An obvious one being the belief in monotheism. And early books of the Bible, the Old Testament, are not monotheistic. And this was a belief which only became adopted over time. So when we look again critically at this tradition, then we can see that the oldest tradition didn't really have a teaching of rebirth. There was an occasional, perhaps, reference to a state of life after death in some vague way, but without really being clear about it. The Atharva Veda, which is the fourth of the Vedas, makes no reference to the doctrine of rebirth. The Brahmanas, these are the ritual texts that explain the rituals carried out on the basis of Vedic authority, show a greater interest in the afterlife, and we meet with a variety of views on this subject, but no conclusive reference to rebirth is found. The concept of a second death, punar mrityu, is pregnant with the possibility of developing the idea of rebirth, and all that can be said is that Brahmanas contain all the suggestions necessary for the development of the doctrine of rebirth. In the early Upanishads, there is intense speculation on the subject of the afterlife, and rebirth is only one of the many theories that are mooted at this time. The very possibility of survival appears to have been questioned. In one place, rebirth is clearly ruled out as impossible. And he gives a quote here from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It is said there are three worlds, the world of men, the world of the fathers, and the world of the gods. The world of men is obtained through a son only, not by any other means. No? This means, in other words, there is no possibility of a future life on earth for the person who dies. Speculation seems to have resulted in a number of one life after death theories of survival after this time, some of them coming down from the Brahmanic tradition. The belief in the possibility of a second death or a continued death and in devices attended to avert this is still strong in the earliest stages of the Upanishads. But despite this conception, we do meet with a number of theories which contemplate the possibility of a single afterlife. And he then refers to a couple of cases which he's discussed earlier. And then a few other examples. And these are interesting because they show that within the Upanishadic tradition, which again, to remind us, is the sort of immediate soil out of which the Buddha grew. That's the immediate cultural and philosophical context. These texts, the Brihadaranyaka, are probably 100 or 200 years before the Buddha and in the same region of India. So we have the idea that the karma of he who reveres the soul as the world does not perish. And out of this soul, this Atman, he creates whatever he likes after death. Yeah, ya Atman eva lokam. And that idea, the Atma is the same as the Loka, is a commonly expressed cosmological view found in the suttas. Again, the ways of expression in the suttas and the Upanishads are very close. So this view, which is being posited here by the Upanishad, is rejected in the suttas quite explicitly. Since his karma does not get exhausted, he would presumably live in this state forever. This same theory of personal immortality is mentioned in the Nikayas as the theory that states that the soul is my world. After death, I shall be permanent, stable, eternal, not subject to change, and I shall remain in that condition eternally. Another such theory holds that the person who is made of mind, manomayo, after departing from this world goes to the wind, the sun, and the moon, and to the world which we have identified, a world that is without heat, without cold, and lives there eternally. A theory which we have identified with one of the rational and eternalist theories referred to in Buddhism. As we've said, the Brahmanic theories persist in a slightly different dress. Thus, the belief that we attain the company of the sun is found in the Chandogya Upanishad, and this is the theory which appears in the Kaushitaki Brahmana and is noted in the Nikayas. In the Taittiriya Upanishad, there's the theory that the person after death changes his states from one to the other. After departing from this world, one proceeds to the state of the self consisting of food or life principle or mind or understanding or bliss. Now, these selves, as we have shown, partly correspond to the selves mentioned in the Potthapada Sutta in the Digha Nikaya. And here the first is said to be Rupi, has form, the last Arupi has no form. It's likely that this theory of survival was thought of when it was held in the Brahmajala Sutta, that the soul has form and does not have form after death. Rupi cha Arupi cha. So all of these are showing this diversity of views and opinions in the early Upanishadic strata, roughly contemporaneous with the Buddha, and which show not only that it wasn't the case that everybody believed in rebirth, but they also show that there was kind of no dogmatic insistence on the matter one way or another. The Brahmanas were perfectly happy to present a lot of different kinds of views about what happened to us after we died. And there was no really orthodoxy about that until much later. The first clear reference to the theory of rebirth is found in the Brihadaranyaka, Chandogya Upanishad, and Kaushitaki. It's only in the Katha Upanishad that for the first time the theory is generally accepted. And thereafter we find its acceptance in the Mundaka and other Upanishads. One thing that he doesn't mention here, just seeing it was mentioned later on, that he doesn't mention here is that not only is this idea of rebirth found first in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, but the manner in which it's found there is also quite telling, because it occurs in the context of a dialogue, and when it comes up to discuss the question of karma, then the person who has to receive the answer is taken by the hand and led to one side and told this teaching in secret. Yeah, it's very interesting that this is clearly not a kind of mainstream view. It was something which was being discussed, but which wasn't necessary for public consumption. And one of the reasons why is because it tends to undermine the authority of the Vedas and the authority of the gods. Because if a person's destiny is due to their own deeds, then why are we doing all of these rituals again? Why are we praying to the gods? Why don't we just live a good life and then get the results from that? So yeah, anyway, so this is the teachings in the Brahmanical scriptures. Jatakas goes on. In addition to these, there's also a body of thinkers who, according to the evidence of both Buddhists and Jains, doubted the possibility of knowing the ultimate truth about survival. And finally, in paragraph 637, there is the materialists. Again, I won't go into that in detail. So there's various people who had different views about rebirth, or who said we can't know whether rebirth is real, or who said that there's no such thing as rebirth. These were all well-known people at the time. Now, besides all of these, in paragraph 638, there was the wider class of the Winyu, or the elite, the intelligentsia, whom we have shown the Buddha was particularly keen on addressing and converting. A man like Payasi, of the Payasi Sutta in the Digha Nikaya, would probably fall into this class, and he, as we've seen, showed a healthy interest in the problem of survival, going so far as to perform experiments in order to discover the truth about him. Even if we dismiss him as a materialist who was more interested in exposing the falsity of the belief, we find that sermons addressed to the Vinyu do not, unlike many other sermons, assume the truth of rebirth or even survival. Thus, in the Apannaka Sutta, where the Buddha appeals to the reflections of the rational person or the Vinyu Purisa, he does not assume the truth of the belief in survival or person or moral responsibility, but uses a wager argument to show that it would be better in the long run to entertain such a belief and act accordingly, irrespective of the consequences. in the Sandika Sutta. So here in the Sandika Sutta, again, this is Majjhima Nikaya number, what is that? Majjhima Nikaya number 76. Again, we find a similar appeal to the reflections of a Vinyu Purisa. There's no assumption of the belief in the survival, and the appeal is purely to rationalist considerations. So here, on a number of grounds, we can see that the Buddha is, that it was not the case that belief in rebirth was universal. It was not the case that people could not question it. It was not the case that the Buddha accepted uncritically. On the contrary, there was a great degree of skepticism, inquiry, and differing views, and the Buddha engaged with those peoples of different views and argued and discussed with them in ways appropriate for the case. 639, when we thus look at the problem historically, we find there are no grounds for holding that the belief in rebirth was universal or even widespread prior to the advent of Buddhism. There were materialist skeptics and those who believed in survival without subscribing to the doctrine of rebirth. These theories were known and criticized in the Buddhist text, and there's no reason to believe that the criticisms of the theories of rebirth by materialist skeptics and others was not known to the Buddhists. The elite seem to have had an open-minded attitude on the subject, and when the Buddhists did accept the doctrines of rebirth and karma, they seem to have done so on the ground that the truth is verifiable. But we may doubt whether this kind of verification was sufficient or adequate to claim the veracity of these theories. So again, Jayatileka here making the same point that I made earlier, which I've made many times before, which is that it's perfectly reasonable to doubt whether rebirth is in fact true. And it's not an obvious thing. And if somebody looks at the evidence and says, well, from all we can see, consciousness is bound up with our body, and then when we die, that's it. It's a perfectly reasonable point of view. I mean, I think that there is evidence for the other point of view. So I'm not saying that I believe that point of view, but I think it's a reasonable point of view. And I think that an intelligent and critical culture should accept that there is a reasonable degree of doubt and discussion that can be had on that topic. That these doctrines were almost universally accepted in the post-Buddhistic Indian tradition is due largely to the fact that the Jains and the Buddhists, the most influential critics of the orthodox Vedic tradition, accepted them, and the materialists who came under fire from all these schools of thought gradually faded out of the Indian philosophical scene. But the picture that we get at the time of the rise of Buddhism was somewhat different, and it would be quite unhistorical to presume that it was the same as what it was in later times. So again, it's not the fact that the Buddha accepted the doctrine of rebirth because everybody else believed in it. On the contrary, it's because the Buddhists and the Jains accepted the doctrine of rebirth. That's why it later became a universal belief. Okay, so this is on the teaching of rebirth. I'm going to pause for a minute there and just see if there's anything in the chat. There's a few things in the chat here. And I will just have a look at a couple of questions before moving on. Okay, so Pravin asks, the suttas often refer to the gods of the 33. Yes, they do, when addressing Brahmins. To what extent does this have roots in the Vedas, Upanishads, and or contemporary Buddhism? Yeah, I mean, clearly we're talking about a group of sort of Vedic sounding gods. Saka, who's Indra, is the boss of them, and obviously drawn from the Vedic pantheon. The whole idea, I mean, it's quite a sort of complex idea, but the 33 gods is a amplification of the idea of a trinity of gods. And the idea of a trinity is already found back in the Rig Vedas. So 33 is the amplified trinity. That idea of the gods associated with Indra and so on is, again, a changing situation. And it was Thomas Rhys Davids who pointed out in his translation of the, I think, Mahasamaya Sutta, that not only that if we look at the kinds of deities found in the suttas, mentioned in the suttas, we find that many of the deities of the Vedas have already disappeared. So some of them, like Indra or Saka, are found, but there's dozens or even hundreds who are no longer mentioned even in the suttas. The suttas then mention a whole bunch of new ones, and some of those new ones are known in later Hinduism and some of them are not. In other words, the picture of the suttas is giving us a snapshot of different kind of beliefs that were prevalent around the time of the Buddha, which is somewhat different from the earlier tradition of the Vedas and also the later tradition of the developed Hindu tradition. And many of the kind of our favorites in Hinduism are either absent from the suttas altogether or are very minor characters in the suttas. Vishnu, Shiva, Krishna, all mentioned perhaps once in the suttas, once or twice. Ganesh not mentioned at all, Skanda not mentioned at all, Kali perhaps mentioned once in the suttas, and so on. All right, so other questions, but as for the details of that historical evolution, that would take us away from our topic a little bit. Yes. That's right. So Deepika makes a point in the suttas. It's not just so Jayatileka here is looking at the evidence from the non-Buddhist scriptures themselves, but of course there's also the evidence in the suttas, which, as Deepika points out, Ajitakesa Kambali was a contemporary of the Buddha, and he did not believe in rebirth, and he as a Lokayata also. Yes, that's correct. So, this in this way, both the position that we find in the suttas agrees with the position that we find from the non-Buddhist scriptures as well. Okay, so Nadine asks, you have emphasized the critical investigation of the Buddha, and I wonder in what ways you think Western and Buddhist forms of critical inquiry overlap and or contradict. Nadine, that is a very broad question, I'm afraid. Overlap in some ways and contradict in some others. I don't know. If you could be more specific, that would be really helpful, because that's maybe a bit too broad to look at. I would say that the general position, I think, is that the Western sciences are certainly much more advanced, obviously, in the critical inquiry in the physical sciences. In terms of the psychological and mental sciences, I think that the Western approach is manifestly far less successful, and with due respect to all my psychologist friends, I would call into doubt whether the Western scientific method is in fact of any use whatsoever in psychology or any of the soft sciences. One area where of course the big difference is in the concept, within the scope of meditative realization, and the idea that we can extend and purify consciousness through meditation is comparable to the Western idea that we can extend and improve our eyes with a telescope. Right? We can use material instruments to amplify and make available certain kinds of information. It's still sensory information, but we can do that through using instruments. And the Buddha said we can do the same thing through meditation. So we can gain access to certain kinds of knowledge that would otherwise be hidden. All right. And yeah, actually Tom's just given a quote to that effect there, so that's good. So yeah, Nadine, that's pretty inadequate response, but perhaps we can talk about that some other time, or look at something a bit more specific. Okay, moving on. What's the time? 46. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so from paragraph number 640, let us turn to the second question. Is the attitude recommended towards the authority of external traditions and persons the same as that expected towards the doctrines of Buddhism itself? So this is a fundamental question about intellectual integrity. The question is related to the alleged omniscience of the Buddha. Did the Buddha claim omniscience and expect his statements to be treated as pronouncement of an omniscient being? If not, how authoritative were these statements? So this is like part of like one of the key tells, if you like, of a bad faith discussion. If somebody's holding you or holding somebody to a standard that they're not applying to themselves. And so you find this kind of thing happens very frequently in discussion, online discussion or whatever. People will say something like, oh, you know, but you believe in this because you're a monk, or because you're a man, or because you're Australian, or because you're an ex-rugby player, or whatever it might be. Therefore, that's why you believe what you believe. And as if sort of arguing that the fact that each of us has a unique perspective somehow determines what that view is, without, of course, applying that same reflection to their own unique perspective and how that shapes their own views as well. And, you know, this comes back to that idea of whether we accept things critically or uncritically. Of course, we have our perspective, and that gives us certain advantages and certain limitations. And a reflective person learns about that. That's part of what wisdom is. It's not just learning information. It's about learning what are the limits to my information. What are the things that I don't see because of my position? You know? And what, you know, as a man, I've never been a mother. I've never had to struggle with trying to attend a Zoom class while looking after my little child. So this is a kind of knowledge and learning that I haven't had. And there are so many things like that. So let us not reduce our own perspective. Perspective is something that should inform our knowledge. It's not something that invalidates it, but we have to be reflective about it and humble about the limitations of our own perspective. So there's a bit of a discussion here on various scholars' points of view about whether the Buddha was omniscient or not. And I'm not going to go into that too much. I don't think it's a particularly interesting discussion. Well, no, it's an interesting discussion, but it's all kind of in the past, more or less. Actually, I think Analio did a paper on omniscience some time ago, so maybe look up that if you want a more up-to-date account of it, rather than these somewhat older scholars. I think a lot of the earlier European scholars were kind of, you know, conditioned from this kind of Western idea of omniscience. But anyway, Jatakas' perspective, which I think is true, is that the Buddha originally didn't really claim omniscience, but he was later said to have claimed omniscience by various traditions. So, but I won't go into a detailed argumentation about that. Okay, and having discussed, to return to this question about how to relate to the statements by the Buddha, we'll forward to paragraph number 652. So having discussed various other scholars, Jatakas says, on the other hand, and I'm going to struggle with this one. Anyone can help me out with the pronunciation? Gyomroy Ludwig? I have no idea, sorry, has said, on the basis of studies of Deities, has observed that whatever the word saddha is met with in early texts, a noteworthy difference between its importance and that of faith in Christianity will be observed. According to her, faith in the sense of trust, confidence in the teacher can be easily understood as an emotion insufficient for salvation, but extremely important on the way to it. Yes, good point. Right? Faith, trust, devotion, insufficient for salvation, but important on the way to it. And goes on to say that it does not mean that the Buddha expects them to accept everything without contradictions. He merely does not prohibit, without contradiction, he certainly does not prohibit criticism and judgment. Absolute a priori faith is never demanded. She tries to show that knowledge is valued above faith in this culture. It is not by chance that the 10 powers of the Buddha are all intellectual, and that these 10 powers are only the normal human intellect developed. The Buddha praises disciples, not for their faith, but for their wisdom. Sariputta is lauded for his wisdom, while in the case of Vakali, the highest of those who had faith, it is requested that he should not be attached to the Buddha's person, but should concentrate on the Dhamma. His excessive faith was a hindrance to salvation. Faith, likewise, is not a characteristic of an arahant. It has no place on the Noble Eightfold Path. If Saddha had been regarded as essential to the attaining of Nibbana, it certainly would have found its place in the Noble Eightfold Path. Lastly, she points out that the person who is described as a Saddha Vimutta, released by faith, is not emancipated at all, while in the lowest rank is the Saddhanusari, who develops 5 faculties essential to release by way of blind faith in and through the law of the Buddha. So this is Dr. Again, apologies for her name, Dr. Gyomroy Lidovic. There is arguing for a more nuanced perspective on the idea of faith. Jayati comments, we are more inclined to agree with her theory than with that of Poisson and Keith, but it is necessary to distinguish at least 2 strata in the evaluation of Saddha within the Pali Canon. In what was probably the earliest stratum, the acceptance of Saddha was strictly consonant with the spirit of the Kalama Sutta, whereas in the latest stratum it is not, though attempts are made to bring it in harmony with its outlook. So Jayati here is arguing that we can see a different strata in understanding faith developing through the Pali Canon. Now, generally speaking, when we speak of the early Buddhist texts, we're talking about the 4 Nikayas, early 6 or 7 early books of the Khuddaka Nikaya. And of course, there is some development and diversity within those. But the difference between those early texts and the later texts is dramatic. And it's almost a different religion. And the difference, if you look in, for example, a text like the Theragatha and Therigatha, you can find what appear to be some evidence of earliness and lateness in a few of those verses. But the difference between the Therigatha and the Theri Apadana is just another world. Right? They have almost nothing in common. And so when looking for historical strata in the suttas, within the Pali Canon, then we have to be clear, do we mean a historical development from the early part of the canon to the later part? In that case, yes, obviously, that's clearly the case that there was. Or are we saying that we can even discern a development within the early portion of the Pali Canon, within the early Buddhist texts? And that is something which is much harder to establish clearly. It's not necessarily impossible by any means, but it's certainly less obvious. Okay, so let us continue. Okay, so there's a translation there. Sorry, just checking my notes here. Right. So Jayati Lekha continues on paragraph 656. It is necessary to observe that there could be many aspects to the study of the concept of faith in Buddhism. Faith has an affective, conative, and cognitive aspect. When Dutt says that Saddha carries 2 distinct meanings, one is faith producing piti, rapture, and the other is self-confidence producing virya, energy, he's speaking of the affective and conative aspects of Saddha respectively, and not of 2 different uses of the word altogether. But when he says that the faith producing joy is an antidote to doubt and moha, he's confusing the affective with the cognitive aspect of faith as belief. We shall be mainly concerned with this last aspect, since it is the only aspect which has an epistemological significance. It's important to remember that this is a characteristic of Jayati Lekha's study and a limitation of Jayati Lekha's study. He's not concerning himself with the emotional dimensions of the Pali Canon and these questions of faith and belief. Obviously, that's important because the emotional dimensions of belief are critical. And but you've got to draw your line somewhere, and you've got to be sure what it is that you're talking about. But as long as we bear in mind that the suttas aren't ignoring an emotional dimension of faith, but that's not what we're discussing right at the moment. All right. Again, sorry, just to skip ahead, 659. So Jatakas discusses a few later texts. He then goes out onto paragraph 659. The object of faith in the Nikayas is most frequently the Buddha. The favorite phrase is, having heard his doctrine, he acquired faith in the Tathagata. Dhammang Sutva Tathagate Sadhang Patilabhati. If Sadha means belief, then acquiring faith in the Buddha is equivalent to saying believing in the Buddha. And what is meant by believing in the Buddha is that one believes that what the Buddha says is true. As Woosley points out, certainly we do talk of believing in a person, but there we mean that we believe that what he says is true. The word pasidati, to have faith in, appreciate, also has the person of the Buddha as the object. But pasada in the compound avecha pasada frequently has the Buddha, his teaching, and his sangha as the objects. Here, faith or belief in the Dhamma means the statements that constitute the Dhamma or the teachings of the Buddha. Likewise, believing in the Sangha implies believing in the truth of the utterances of the Sangha, since these are more or less derived from the Buddha. It again ultimately implies a belief in the statements of the Buddha. It would appear from all this that the expected attitude towards the statements of the Buddha was one of belief rather than neutralism or disbelief. And this appears prima facie to go against the injunctions of the Kalama Sutta, which says that one should not accept the truth of propositions on authoritative grounds. But a careful study of what is in fact said in the Kalama Sutta with the concept of saddha presents a very different picture. It tends to show, as we shall see in the sequel, that the attitude towards authority recommended by the Buddha is not contradictory to and is in fact compatible with the attitude recommended by the Buddha towards his own statements. In order to see this imperative, we have a clear picture of what the sermons to Galama and Bhadali do and do not state. These sermons do state that no statements should be accepted on authority because it is possible that such statements may turn out to be either true or false. They do not state that such statements should be rejected altogether, nor do they state that we should not test the opinions of others, but should rely entirely on our own wits for the discovery of truth. In fact, in asserting that one should not accept P on authority because P may be true or false, it is also implied that one should not reject P because P may be true, P here being the thesis. So an excellent point that Jatakas is making here. The Kalama Sutta doesn't say we should reject things on faith outright, and because what is said under faith may be true or false, which then implies that actually it may be true. This is exemplified in the attitude of the disciple as represented in the Nikayas, which should be one of neither acceptance nor rejection when one is in doubt as to the truth of the statement. When a fellow monk claims the highest knowledge, one should neither accept what he says nor reject it, but without acceptance or rejection should question him. The latter being a quote from the suttas, which is repeated in many places, in order to test the veracity of his statement. Again, just to pause on that moment. Neither accepting nor rejecting, but inquiring. And this is the epistemological posture that the Buddha gives in the suttas. It appears to be a common attitude at this time, for we find a certain householder adopting it towards a statement of the Buddha, and the wandering ascetic Pataliputta having the same attitude towards a statement of the monk Samiti. So it's not unique to Buddhism, this attitude. It's very characteristic of Buddhism, but not unique to Buddhism. The passage addressed to Kalama ends on the note that one should reject opinions as false only after one has tested them in light of one's own experience, taking into account the views of the wise. This means that the statements claiming to be true on authority should be rejected as false only after one has discovered their falsity after personally verifying them. It does not rule out the possibility, but on the contrary, seems to imply that those statements claiming to be true should be tested before deciding to accept or reject them. And this is just what the Buddha seems to demand from his own hearers regarding his own statements. He does not want his own statements accepted on his authority nor rejected, but seems to demand that they be tested and accepted if they are found to be true, and presumably rejected if they are found to be false. This attitude is well respected in a late verse, which appears in the Tattva Sangraha and the Tibetan version of the Jnana Samuccaya Sara, a rare instance where Jatakas is quoting from a later text. And the verse as follows: just as wise men test a claim to be gold by burning, cutting, or rubbing on a touchstone, my statements, O monks, should be accepted after examination and not out of respect for me. This verse is not found in the Nikayas, but it reflects the attitude of the Buddha as often represented in the Nikayas. The Buddha is anxious to see that his statements are not accepted out of respect for his authority as his teacher, the very thing he condemns in the Kalama Sutta. On one occasion, and this is from the Majjhima Nikaya, he says, would you, O monks, knowing and seeing this way, say, our teacher is respected? We say so out of respect for our teacher. Okay, and here, the phrase here, our teacher is respected, sattha no garu, is almost exactly the same as one of the lines in the Kalama Sutta, samano no garu, our ascetic is respected. Thus, if we interpret the Kalama Sutta as saying that one should not accept the statements of anyone on authority, nor even seriously consider the views of others in order to test their veracity, but rely entirely on one's own experiences in the quest and discovery for truth, then this would be contradictory to the concept of saddha in the Pali Nikayas. And that interpretation of the Kalama Sutta is, in fact, very common. And you'll see frequently posters and cards and Instagram thingies and all of these things quoting from the supposed Kalama Sutta, which are in fact positing this exact same idea. But if, on the other hand, we interpret the Kalama Sutta as saying that while we should not accept the statements of anyone as true on the grounds of authority, we should test the consequences of statements in the light of our own knowledge and experience in order to verify if they're true or false. It will be an attitude which is compatible with saddha as understood in at least one stratum of Pali canonical thought. Okay, good. So let's just pause for another minute. Let's see where we're up to. 76. Okay, let me just check the chat, see how we're going. Yes, Bhante, even if we view the galaxies with the use of a telescope, ultimately we have to use our eye to see it. Is that true? Normally we do. Do we have to? What about our friend who had the cyborg who had like a had an antenna stuck into his brain? Maybe he wouldn't have to use our eyes. But yes, normally that's right. I mean, normally a telescope amplifies the capacity of sight. So that's the idea. So the idea with Buddhism, he amplifies the capacity of the mind. So Vijita says there's a difference between Shraddha and Bhakti. Yeah, so Bhakti tends to be a later idea and sort of arose in later centuries, especially in most explicitly in Hinduism. But you find a lot of that kind of Bhakti sense in Buddhism as well. But yeah, so the saddha which the Buddha is talking about is a more kind of inquiring and reasoned faith. Okay. So Tom asks, is this knowledge making through direct experience? Where does this knowledge come from? Do we have great meditators to access? Do we have to be great meditators to access knowledge in this way? Well, yes and no. I mean, it's like saying, what's the view from Mount Everest like? Do you have to be a great mountain climber to be able to see it? Well, you can look at the video that somebody made, or you can read somebody's account. But if you want to actually see it properly, then yeah, you have to put in the work and you have to get up there. So at the end, but we'll be looking more at meditative knowledge in the next session. So far this one, we're looking at faith and reason. So the next two paragraphs are actually really interesting ones, but I'm also wanting to move ahead. So I might skip them. Let's just stop for a few minutes and have just a short meditation. It's a bit of a break. And following the meditation, we will move on. Oh, no, actually, before we do that, I'll just briefly mention a few points without going into detail on Jayati Lekha's argumentation. So a few points before we leave the topic of faith. And I've probably mentioned these before, but just to make sure that we cover all our ground. In 665, Jaitileka talks about the Chanki Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, which begins with a process of understanding the truth, beginning with approaching a teacher, asking, inquiring, reflecting about it, and then applying it in one's own experience. The Chanki Sutta, probably the most important single sutta on epistemology in the Buddhist in the canon. So please do read it if you're not familiar with it. The Vimamsaka Sutta is also another very interesting one, where the Buddha encourages his Sangha to inquire and test him. He says, you should test me. This is a very powerful thing for a religious teacher to say, and gives them a very stringent methodology for doing so. Finally, we should mention a couple of terms associated with the idea of faith. Occasionally in the suttas, we find the idea of akaravati saddha, where akaravati means reasoned faith. So faith which is based on reasons, faith which is rational. Of course, even though that term only appears in a couple of places, normally when the Buddha is referring to faith in his system, that's what he means. The more common phrase that's found is avecha pasada, which has a slightly different, it's a similar idea, but has a slightly different sense. Avecha pasada, avecha literally means having undergone. And that's the literal meaning. Ava is under, Icha is the absolutive for to go. So avicca is literally having undergone. And what it means is the confidence that you acquire having undergone something. So this is the kind of confidence that you have if once you've experienced something for yourself. And so it's a bit different from reasoned faith. Okay, so reasoned faith is like a plausible or reasonable hypothesis. So the Buddha might say, for example, if you watch your breath and be mindful of the in-breaths and out-breaths by watching such a cool and calming process, then this will cool and calm your mind. And I say, well, if I have faith, and the Buddha says this because he was clearly a great teacher, a meditation teacher, and that seems like a reasonable approach to meditation. And so this would be akaravati saddha. But avecha pasada would be when you've actually done that meditation and you've experienced that coolness and that calm of mind yourself, and you know from your own experience, yes, in fact, what the Buddha was talking about, it is very true because I know what that peace of mind is. Speaking of which, let us test the Buddha out. Let us see whether we can find whether he was right or not. Was the Buddha right to say that when you watch your breath, that your mind will become peaceful? Who knows? Maybe he was wrong, okay? In which case we can all, whatever, go to the movies or something like that. But no, let us test it and see what happens. So let's give it 5 minutes meditation. All right, so I'm going to skip the remainder of the section on faith and forward to the section on reason. And this will begin with paragraph number 679. Now, just as with the question of faith, the Buddha adopts a position of that is reasonable and moderate, neither dismissing the role of reason nor accepting it as a sole arbiter of truth. Faith is a quality that is very helpful and very useful, and which can is part of our spiritual path, but faith alone can't tell us what is true and what is not true. And the same is true of reason. Particularly, reason has a number of roles. It has a role of, first of all, it can clarify things. Reason can help us to rule out a whole range of things that can't be true, right? So even though we can't use reason alone to find what the truth is, we can certainly say, well, there's a bunch of things that can't be the case. So at least we can not worry about those too much. And reason also has a rhetorical role in terms of persuading people and creating a manner of dialogue. And that last part is really critical. One of the books which is most influential to me as a young man in my own kind of intellectual growth was a book by a somewhat notorious philosopher of science called Paul Feyerabend, who wrote a book called Against Method. And it's a book which is kind of regarded as one of the kind of bad boys of modern philosophy. But essentially, he argued that scientists didn't really discover scientific truth by scientific method. He said that they realized that things are true because of an intuition, and they use scientific method to persuade others. And it just happens that the ones that we remember are the ones who turned out to be true. And therefore their persuasions was honest. I mean, even the way, I mean, it, maybe a little bit too extreme in that, in that kind of blunt way, but there's certainly something to that idea that a rational and critical methodology is there. Part of its role is about finding the truth, but it's also about creating a culture that facilitates a reasonable way, like a ground in which reasonable and intelligent adults can have a conversation about things. And that's not a small thing, yeah. And this is, again, one of the things that we find today is that this possibility of a civil and rational discourse seems so very hard to find, especially on social media and the like, that because you have to have a shared assumption of good faith. And it's not an easy thing to maintain in an online situation where we don't have that kind of degree of personal trust. All right. So Jatakas begins, paragraph 679. We shall next consider the role of reason within Buddhism. In doing so, we shall have to examine the following questions. Does the Buddha arrive at his doctrine by reason? No. What kind, I'm just giving you the quick answer, you can zone out for the rest of it if you like. What kind of reasoning, if any, is put forward in defense of his doctrine? Does the Buddha or his disciples criticize other doctrines on rational grounds? And if so, what kind of reasoning do they employ? Okay, so skipping the next paragraph, it's clear that we cannot make any significant statements about the Buddha being a rationalist or not, unless there is a clear and consistent use of the term rationalist. And since we are trying to evaluate the thought of Buddhism philosophically, it is desirable that we use the term in its strictly philosophical connotation. Rationalism is used in philosophical language in opposition to empiricism, and it is defined as a theory of philosophy in which the criterion of truth is not sensory, but intellectual and deductive, usually associated with an attempt to introduce mathematical methods into philosophy, as in Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. In trying to determine whether the Buddha was a rationalist in this sense, we shall have to see whether the Buddha in any sense considered certain premises as being self-evidently true and deduced the rest of his philosophy from them. And again, the answer to that is no, that he didn't. But just to sort of very kind of briefly state on that, so this idea that we can have self-evidential premises which are self-evident, I mean, it's problematic, isn't it? Because what's self-evident to one person is very far from self-evident to someone else. And usually what you find is that when somebody talks about self-evident premises, that they're in fact reading their conclusions or their biases into those premises. And so what they claim to be deductive reasoning, in fact, is dependent on their own assumptions. Anyway, from 683, when we thus examine whether the Buddha was a rationalist in this sense, we find that he rejected such claims. It is stated that according to a contemporary of his, Buddha's doctrines were a product of pure reasoning and were not based on any extrasensory perception or extraordinary insight. Sunakata, who left the order dissatisfied, observes that the recluse Gautama does not have a distinctive knowledge and vision more than that of other men. He preaches a doctrine which is a product of reasoning and speculation and is self-evident. The Buddha denies that it is so, and it is a veritable denial that he was a rationalist in the above sense of the term. We have no reason to doubt this claim, since nothing in the Nikaya suggests that any doctrines were taught or considered to follow from premises which were held to be true in an a priori sense. On the contrary, we always find the Buddha recommending doctrines which are claimed to be true in an empirically or experientially verifiable sense. We've already seen that the reason for the rejection of theories based on taka, reasoning or rationality, was that the reasoning may be valid or invalid. And even if the reasoning was valid and consistent, the theories may be true or false in the light of facts. Pure reason was therefore no safe guide for the discovery of truth. Goes on, 684. But this does not mean that taka was not of limited value. The Sandika Sutta classifies, so again, this is Majjhima number 76, to classifies religious theories based on taka as not necessarily false, and the statement addressed to Ananda that so far as anything can be ascertained by reasoning, you have ascertained it, seems to imply that taka did have some value. Again, this is really important because in religious and philosophical spheres, specifically in Buddhist and spiritual spheres, we find a rather loose tendency to slip from a position that says, well, you can't know everything by reason, which is true and reasonable, to then a position of, well, critical and rational thought has no part in spiritual life. And as soon as we go down that road, we very quickly end up as a cult. Because when religious teachers are telling you, you can't find out things by reason, what they are telling you, in fact, is don't question what I say. Don't criticize what I say. Don't hold what I say to these standards of evidence. And very often it becomes an excuse for not knowing how to use reason. And this is something which I think is a big problem in spiritual circles. I personally believe that a large amount, and I'm not being kind of facetious here, but I believe that many, perhaps most adults don't know how to think logically. They just don't. And we learn ways of thinking logically in specific contexts, dependent on our training and education and so on, but we don't really learn how to apply that in a general sense. We think we do, but actually we don't really. And so I think that it's quite amenable to people to hear, oh, you don't have to use reason, because then it's basically becomes laziness. I don't have to apply this. I don't have to test this. I don't have to question this. These are all hard things to do. And then it's an excuse. And for the people who are in positions of power, then it becomes an excuse to maintain that power without having anyone question them. So this is always a good thing to do when you see people in positions of power. Ask them hard questions and see what they say and how they react to it. And we see that this happened to the Buddha all the time. People were asking him hard questions all the time, and he always reacted in a very nice way. Anyway, Jatakas continues with the example from, actually, I'll skip that one. That's the Chula Vibhanga Sutta. I'll skip that one. Where are we now? Reason is persuasion, 686. Although there is little evidence that any of the basic doctrines of Buddhism are derived by reason, we sometimes meet with the Buddha recommending his doctrines on rational grounds. This is particularly evident where his sermons are addressed to the Vinyu or the intellectual elite, who seem to represent the open-minded rationalists. Thus, in the Apannaka Sutta, we find such an appeal to reason. It is addressed to the Brahmin householders of Salayaka, who are said not to have developed even a rational faith towards any teacher. Sattha yasmin no akaravati sadha pati ladha. And again, this term akaravati sadha. To them, the Buddha recommends the following infallible dhamma, apannaka dhamma. So apannaka has this kind of idea of guaranteed. I can't remember how I translated it in my translations. Anyway, here it basically means that it works out well on both sides. So the infallibility is purely logical and rational. He says that there's two doctrines, one denying survival and moral responsibility, and the other diametrically opposed to this, which asserts survival and moral responsibility. The Buddha says that in this situation, a rational person would reason as follows. If a person adopts the first alternative and there is no next world, then he will have no cause for regret. But if there is a next world, then he would suffer. In any case, he would be reproved in this life as an immoral person and a disbeliever. But if there is the next world, he would stand to lose in both worlds. Thus, in adopting this alternative, he's depending on one possibility. On the other hand, if a person adopts the second alternative and there is a next world, he would be happy after death. In any case, he'll be praised in this life as a virtuous person, and if there is a next world, he would stand to gain in both worlds. And then Jatakas goes on to give the logical form of that argument. And so this is, and he points out that this is reminiscent of the famous philosophical argument known as Pascal's wager. So Pascal's wager is essentially the idea that it may be extremely improbable that God exists, yet if we acknowledge that the chance that God exists is like 0.000001%, okay, then it still makes sense to believe in God. Why? Because hell is eternal. And infinity times 0.000001 is still infinity. So you're better off believing. So this is Pascal's wager. In the theistic sense, Pascal's wager doesn't quite work as a philosophical argument, for one reason being that there is a non-zero possibility that many incompatible gods exist. So I'm going to believe that the God of the Bible is the one and only true God, and I'm also going to believe that that Vishnu is the one and only true God, and I'm also going to believe that Mithras and all of the others one and only one true God. Anyway, so you can see that there's a bit of a problem there. So I see Venerable Analia has joined us. Welcome, Aya. I hope the meeting went okay. So anyway, right. So here in that case, in the Apannaka Sutta, we can see that the Buddha is not threatened by a rational and a critical audience. On the other hand, on the contrary, he seems to relish it. He enjoys saying that we can sort of engage with this in a rational way, and we can look at it from this perspective and that perspective, and then follow through the different possibilities, and showing that, and this shows that from a Buddhist point of view, it's true that Buddhism says that if you are good in this life, that will result in a good rebirth. However, the Buddha did not hang his doctrine of morality off a belief in rebirth. Even if you don't believe in rebirth, it still makes sense to live a good life in this life. This, in fact, was the basis of an argument that I made some time ago on our forum, where I talked about Buddhism for psychopaths. And I posited this argument quite seriously, because there are psychopaths in this world and they have to live. And, normally when we think of a psychopath, we think of somebody who is, purely evil or something like that. But a psychopath isn't evil. They merely don't have any conscience or compassion. And there are plenty of psychopaths who live perfectly good lives. But they don't do good lives because they have a feeling about what's right or wrong, or because they have compassion for somebody. They live good lives because they rationally work out that it's in their self-interest to live a good life. And so this kind of reasoning that we see in the Apannaka Sutta is actually perfect. If you ever meet a psychopath who asks, why should I follow Buddhism? Then here you go, refer them to the Apannaka Sutta. And you can see that actually doing good is good for you. People will respect you. They will like you. It will be to your advantage to do what's good. And so then I don't think I think if you're a psychopath, I think your potential for spiritual advancement is limited, but still, if you can live a good life and be a moral person, then that's okay. I mean, it's interesting. I've read a number of accounts by psychopaths who talk about this, and some of them in marriages, for example, and they work with their spouse to actually figure out how to try to be a decent person and so on. And it is possible. Anyway, okay, moving along. 686, 687. Okay. 686, 691. Just keeping my eye on the time. From a couple of interesting paragraphs at 691 and 692, the Buddha did reason with those who come to debate with him. He's also reported to have known the trick of converting his opponents to his views. With the Upali Sutta gives a concrete example of this trick that the Buddha used, where he engaged in Socratic dialogue with Upali and defeated him with a series of dialectical arguments. The Buddha starts with an assumption of his opponent and by a series of questions leads him to a position in which he contradicts himself. And it's pointed out that what he said earlier is not compatible with what he has said later and vice versa. So this is considered to be a disproof of his opponent's original proposition. So this is what's known as Socratic dialogue, very characteristic of Socrates' manner of doing philosophical conversations. The Buddha doesn't use it as often as Socrates does, but he does use it from time to time. And notice the way that he does it here is not necessarily to establish the truth, but to disprove false versions of the truth. The bulk of the arguments against other theories do not seem to belong in the earliest stratum of the Nikayas. They occur, for instance, in the Sandaka Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, the Payasi Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, and also in such works as the Jatakas. These arguments may belong to an earlier period, though recorded later, or it may have been the case that while the Buddha confined himself on the whole to the exposition of his own doctrines rather than criticism of his opponents, this was no longer possible when Buddhism had become a full-fledged missionary religion and had to fend with its opponents. So, won't go into that too much, but anyway, his idea that basically you find that in that slightly later stage that there are some more kind of developed rational arguments with non-Buddhists. Again, we're talking here within the four Nikayas. So remember that, partly within the four Nikayas. Remember what I said before about that distinction between earlier and later stages. So this is still within the early section, but perhaps the later part of the early section, but also in the Jatakas, which I'll come back to in a second. In paragraph 693, Jayatilleka says, it's significant that almost all these arguments of the form modus tollendo tollens. Now, I confess it's been so long since I studied logic, I had to look that up. But modus tollens is the logical argument, a deductive argument or known as denying the consequent. So it has the form if P, then Q, which implies not Q, therefore not P. And so this is the kind of argument which we find. And again, this is a kind of argument which is not aimed at establishing the truth, but aimed at refuting false ideas of the truth. In the Therigatha, it is said that if the water baptism can free one of evil karma, then the fishes, tortoises, frogs, etc., straight to heaven will go. But Q, that is the consequence, is absurd or evidently false, implying the falsity of the implicans of the first statement, P. This idea is at best only barely suggested in the Udana verse, which says there is no spiritual purification from water, many of the folk who bathe there. 694 talks about similar arguments in the Payasi Sutta and the Sandaka Sutta. I'm going to briefly mention here about the role of this kind of argumentation in the Jatakas. Now, this is actually very interesting. Jatakas, of course, fall outside of the early Buddhist texts, and they relate to a somewhat later period of Buddhism. And yet, many of the Jatakas seem to stem from an early period. the Jatakas, of course, are set in a time before the Buddha, and it's quite likely that many of them do in fact derive from a time before the Buddha, although they may have been retold and elaborated over a long period. Normally, when we think of Jatakas, we think of tales which are suitable for children. We think of morality fables and so on. And of course, we do find a lot of those things in the Jatakas. But many of the Jatakas are also very sophisticated and contain highly elaborate mythological narratives and ideas. And in addition, in certain cases, they contain quite sophisticated philosophical argumentation of the kind which you don't quite meet really anywhere else. A good example of this is the Golden Peacock Jataka, which contains this quite elaborate discussion on the nature of the heavens and afterlife and so on. And another example is given by Jaitileka here in the Mahabodhi Jataka, where we find the Bodhisattva criticizing the doctrines of 5 ministers who represent 5 heretical doctrines. The context is one in which the 5 ministers accuse the Bodhisattva of having killed a monkey and thus committed an evil act. The rebuttal consists of showing that according to the theories of each of these ministers, killing would not be a crime, and therefore, on the one hand, they have no right to accuse him, while on the other hand, these theories are false. The first theory to be criticized is that of the non-causationist. It is said that if acts are uncaused, who is responsible for an evil deed? The argument is that if P, if one acts without will, is true, then Q, no one is responsible for the evil, is true, but Q is evidently false, implying that P must be false. The second theory is that of the theist. It is argued that the truth of theism implies that man is not responsible for his actions, which is assumed to be false. If God designs the life of the entire world, the glory and the misery, the good and the evil acts, man is but an instrument of his will, and God alone is responsible. Elsewhere in the Jatakas, the argument from evil is used to disprove the proof of theism by means of the same modus tollendo tollens. If Brahma is Lord of the whole world and creator of the multitude of beings, then why has he ordained misfortune in the world without making the whole world happy? Or for what purpose has he made the world full of injustice, deceit, falsehood, and conceit? Or the Lord of beings is evil in that he has ordained injustice when there would not have been justice? And so on. So he goes on with some more arguments of a similar form. So I think it's interesting that to look into the Jatakas as a rich source for ideas which were prevalent in the Buddhist community around the time of King Ashoka or a little later, and which contains kinds of discussions and ideas which are not met with in the same way in the more kind of formal philosophical texts. Okay, now skipping a few more paragraphs here, we're going to go forward to paragraph 702. No, 701, 702. Okay. So Jaitileka then goes on to consider the Katawatu. I will skip over most of what he says about the Katawatu, in fact. Those of you who were at my talk last night, I talked about Upagupta, and his contemporary at the time of King Ashoka was the monk Moggaliputta. Moggaliputta was the traditional author of the Katawatu. And his claim of the tradition that he authored this in the time of King Ashoka is, generally speaking, treated as credible within modern scholarship. The Katawatu was certainly expanded at a later time, but it seems very likely that the initial core of it was written around that time. And the Katawatu consists of a very extensive series of arguments about Buddhist doctrines. It doesn't concern non-Buddhist doctrines at all, only concerns disputes over interpretation of Buddhist teachings. And you can see within there that a lot of the kernels of the doctrinal disputes between the different schools of early Buddhism are found there. So the arguments in the Katawatu are all based on a series of assertions and propositions and negations. Is this true? Yes, it is true. But is that true? No, that is not true. But then this contradicts that. And so the two different sides are engaging in a discussion. each of the sides assumes that the suttas, they have the same suttas and that they regard them as an authoritative source. And so the questions are really about interpretations of those sources. So the Katawatu, the logical method of the Katawatu is quite intricate and sort of needs to be studied carefully to kind of make sense of any individual instance. But the basic idea is again the idea of the clarification of the Buddhist doctrines by using a logical or rational means. Okay, so but I won't discuss it in any more detail because it's just a bit too specialized to get into. Okay, so that is. Did I translate Panika as guaranteed? Did I? I thought I used something more clever than that.
Panika Sutta, Bhante said guaranteed.
Did I?
Yes, Bhante.
Okay. It has something to do. It has something to do with like a game of dice, where when you like flip the coin, you know that both sides it's going to comes up heads. It's that kind of idea that you kind of like loaded dice. So it's like an Apanika question is like a loaded question because either way it's going to turn up. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so let's have a look. Thank you for everyone's comments. I'm going to just go briefly and have a look at answering a few of see if I can answer a few of the questions in the chat. Okay, so Deepika's posted the Chunky Sutta. Thank you for that. Korakot from Thailand asks, how is trailing in Upekkha makes you more psychopathic? Oh, I don't think it does, especially if you do it the right way. Although, I mean, I think the other thing could be true. I think that a psychopath or somebody who has those kinds of tendencies can easily convince themselves that they have Upekkha, right? And that they find they can rationalize their own indifference there. So Upekkha, really, the real meaning of Upekkha means to watch closely over, and it doesn't mean indifference or not caring at all. Right? So a psychopath doesn't care. So someone who has Upekkha watches closely over. Upekkha is closely associated with wisdom and with mindfulness, and you have to care in order to have Upekkha, but you're watching over without interfering. Right? So this is the idea of Upekkha. But I don't think that is something that we need to be careful of, because it is easy to grab the snake by the tail and to take different Buddhist teachings and to use that to justify your own ideas. And, certainly a psychopath would do that. Okay, Charit asks, Bhante, would you please be able to explain briefly on what you said about thinking logically in a general sense, perhaps how people go wrong in their generalization of applying logical thinking and how we should do it? Okay. Okay, well, I think the number one thing that we do is that we step outside of our field of expertise. So we, as adults, and once we've got some education, we have some sort of mastery of a particular field or something like that, and we're good. We're good at accounting, or we're good at engineering, or we're good at law, or we're good at these kinds of things. And within that context, we're able to apply logic effectively. We're able to discuss logically and effectively with others in the same field, or programming. Charit, you're a programmer, so that's another field, right? So you can discuss with other programmers, and you have a field in which you share certain assumptions, and you can you understand some terminology. You can use commonly shared ideas. Like in a programming context, I might say worse is better, and a programmer will know what I mean by that. But that requires some kind of understanding of context, right? The history of programming, and how these things are done. So all of that kind of culture around it, all of that, and within that context, because we're surrounded by our peers, we've had to learn our craft. So we've had our ideas tested, and we've had our bad ideas shot down, and we've actually had to prove ourselves by putting the rubber to the road. Right? If you're a programmer and you design a program, it works or it doesn't work. At the end of the day, the thing boots up and it does what it's supposed to do, or it just doesn't. And if it doesn't work, then, well, you know, what is it that you're doing? You don't have any professional competence. So what tends to happen, though, is that as we get older, we kind of, I think, forget about how much hard work it took to get there. We forget about the kinds of domain experience that we learned. We forget about all the wrong paths that we went down. And we kind of assume that the reason that I know how to do this is because I'm good, I'm smart, right? I know what I'm doing. And so we assume that I can make statements about whatever, economics and politics and film history and anything else with equal authority that we did in our own field. So that ability to apply reason, we haven't tested it in those other fields in the same way that we have within our own fields. Somebody said that you know when you're getting old. How do you know when you're getting old? When you wake up in the morning with a sore neck and inexplicably strong opinions about architecture. And so this is the thing, right? And we get these opinions about all these things that we don't actually know very much about. And we think that we can apply it in those same kinds of areas. And we don't get the same pushback from professionals in those areas than we do in our own field. So this is, I think, one of the main mechanisms that this happens. And so what we have to do is we have to sort of have some epistemological humility. And when we step into a domain outside of our own, we have to listen to what the experts are saying in that domain. And we have to have some appreciation for the fact that they've been through that process and I haven't. And so to be very cautious about the way that we extend what we say in other domains. And if you do that, then you can learn that there are things that can be said in domains in which you're not an expert. It's not saying that non-experts can have nothing to say. You can have something to say, but just don't assume that you're an expert. Yeah, and we can still have a conversation, we can still have opinions, because of course there's plenty of things that the experts don't know as well. So it's just a question of having that caution and that epistemological humility when speaking outside of what your field of expertise is. That's one of the really important things. Okay. Okay, Deepika then asks, Bhante, do you think Pascal's logic says just believing in God guarantees entry to heaven? Don't they have to strictly follow the God's word? Well, that's another kind of sort of complex discussion within different schools of theism. And there are some who believe that you can achieve salvation purely by faith, and others who say that you need to have faith and good works. My favorite commentary on that was in the film Cape Fear. Don't know if anybody remembers Cape Fear, one of the last films I ever saw before I became a monk. I think it was it Robert De Niro who was playing the lead character there, and he had a sticker on his car. Both of us are sinners, but one of us is saved.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a serial killer. So there's that, but he believed that because he believed in God, that he could still be saved, even though he was a serial killer. So that may be a somewhat extreme expression of that point of view, but still that kind of idea. So there's a kind of conflict within theistic traditions about those two things. And I should say that the fact that that conflict exists is not necessarily a bad thing. in many ways, religious traditions are vitalized by the presence of tensions within them, because that's what stops you from becoming too dogmatic about your faith. And so within a Christian religious tradition, there's room for a variety of opinions about the roles of faith and good works. So, I mean, I think that position in Buddhism is somewhat different. In Buddhism, it's very clear that you don't have faith alone is not going to get you salvation, but you have to actually live a good life. Yeah, but interesting that that's also a difference between the Bible and the Quran. The Quran, I think, makes a clear statement about that. I can't remember what it says, but I think it makes a clear statement about that. Anyway, moving on. I should not step outside my area of expertise. Moving on. Could this perhaps explain the Dunning-Kruger effect? Well, I think it's certainly related to the Dunning-Kruger effect. And for those of you who don't know, the Dunning-Kruger effect is the idea that, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the idea is that, how does it go again? That intelligent people usually overestimate the intelligence of people that they're talking to. Is that right? And unintelligent people will think that they're more intelligent than they really are. I can't even remember how it goes now. It's something like that. So basically, you tend to assume that people are like you, is the idea. And so, yeah, it's a difficult problem, and it's a difficult issue. Because, again, it's just that question of balance. And I think one of the things that's really important for me about the way the Buddha handles these issues is that they're always in a way which is moderate. Faith is there. Faith is a part of our lives. And if we reject faith, we reject part of who we are. Faith is a reality. It doesn't exist because of some religious doctrine about it. It's part of how humanity works. And the reason that it's part of how it works is because it's efficient. Because we don't have to just not believe anything that anyone's saying. We operate within a climate and a culture where we have some trust in others. And a culture where you lose that trust in others is a culture that rapidly becomes dysfunctional. It just does. You can't live if you don't trust your government at all. If you don't trust anything, then the world becomes a terrifying and scary place. But on the other hand, you can't just believe anything blithely. You can't just believe anything on faith. And this is one of the things that I learned from the Aboriginal elders that I've discussed with. One time I had a discussion about this, and we were talking about education methods and how knowledge is passed down from one generation to the next. And what this elder said was that in their tradition, that they would pass down like the knowledge of where are the water holes, where is the food, where is the fruit, where are the seasons, where are the walking paths, and all of these kinds of things would be conveyed through the stories and education. But every so often they would lie to their kids, and they would say to them, there's a water hole off by that hill. So, you go for a day's walk and you go out to that water hole, and then you have a nice drink and you can enjoy the fruits there and so on, and then you can come back. And so the kids go off and there's no water hole there. And they spend the night thirsty and hungry, like, what's going on? And come back and say, but you were wrong, there's no water hole. He said, you should have known. Yeah, I haven't taught you to believe things blindly. You should have seen, there were no flowers growing. You should have seen that the trees weren't green. You should have seen that the fish weren't swimming. You should have seen that the wind wasn't blowing that way. You should have tested what I said to see whether what I'm saying is right or wrong. Because it will always be the case that sometimes the knowledge that you give is wrong. And no matter even if you're in indigenous wisdom is passed down for tens of thousands of years. But the land is always changing. Everything is changing. And the fact that there is a water hole one year does not mean there's going to be a water hole the next year. The fact that the fruit is growing one year does not mean that the fruit is going to be growing the next year. And impermanence is a fundamental feature of this world in which we're living in. And so this is why that attitude of questioning had to be part of that, that way of testing. So I'm sure that that was a fairly effective way of getting, you probably wouldn't have to be taught that lesson twice. But yeah, so, and the same, I think that, you know, the same applies with the attitude to reason. And, you know, we have to walk a fine line, because if we reject reason, where are we going to be? If we reject reason, we don't have a basis for a shared and civil discussion. If we reject reason, then we are just sitting there blaring our opinions at each other. And at a bare minimum, we need to accept that reason has this negative role of pruning the branches that are going in the wrong direction. Yeah? And this is something that's really important for your own personal reflection and understanding, to be able to test what you know according to reason. Is this right? Is this wrong? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now that's good. When you're wrong, it's good. Yeah. You can redirect yourself, but you can't just merely through reason sort everything out and find the answer to every problem. So that idea of that limited role of reason, also a really important theme here, I think, from Jatakas' work. Okay, so I'm going to finish up. I asked a few questions with this course, and well, a couple of them we've sort of looked at in passing, but one which I asked here, which I'll just leave for your reflection: what if meditation doesn't work? So the Buddha taught us that meditation works and it makes your mind peaceful, but meditation is complex. Sometimes you meditate and you go, oh, no, that feels bad. I'm suffering. Oh, I feel agitated. And so, like, you know, the Buddha said, test his teachings. What if it turns out that you put them to the test and it doesn't work? What does that mean? And I think that that's something that we all kind of need to take seriously. And certainly with things like questions like rebirth and so on, that, you know, we have to accept that there are different ways of looking at it. Another question that I asked here for reflection is, what modern evidence do we have that was not available in the time of the Buddha? And clearly we have a lot of scientific knowledge, a lot of knowledge of the physical world, both in terms of evidence and in terms of theoretical knowledge. And it would be, I think, a shame if we were to merely either dismiss that kind of knowledge or just assume that that kind of knowledge is going to be the same as what we find in the suttas. In both of those cases, we don't actually learn from it, and we don't benefit from what possibly both science and Buddhism might learn from each other. They will only learn from each other. We'll only actually get anything new. We'll only actually get anything creative if we assume that there's something of value in those different systems. And I alluded to this a little bit before, and I'm quite serious about it, that I've come more and more to believe that the methods of that scientific method as such is in many ways a, how do I put this? In many ways is a false road. I think the success of the scientific method in the hard sciences has convinced us that it's a general way of finding knowledge, which will be as in the soft sciences. And yet hundreds of years of applying scientific method to psychology and sociology and economics and so on has really failed to produce any kind of results even vaguely comparable to the results that we have in the hard sciences. I mean, it's not even in the same ballpark. And so that's not to say that we haven't developed understanding in those areas, But have we developed understanding because of scientific method? Or have we developed understanding despite it? Is it merely the fact that we have understanding in those areas because bunches of intelligent people applied themselves to those problems? Would they have got better or comparable results not using scientific method at all? I mean, consider the field of psychology, you know, so many psychologists wasting their times watching rats run around mazes. Would we have been better off if they'd sat in a park and mused about the nature of the human mind? Maybe, right? And so I don't think that there's any real clear evidence that scientific method really works at all outside of the hard sciences. And in fact, it may be just that what's happened is because of the unprecedented and spectacular success of scientific method in the hard sciences, that we've been trying to replicate that across all the different realms of human experience and haven't really grappled with the fact that it's just not going to work. And maybe in the soft sciences, we should stop trying to chase the coattails of physics and stop trying to pretend that we're sciences and just accept the fact that we're doing something which is quite different and which has its own methodology and its own means. Anyway, I just leave that thought with you for today. We should probably wrap up around there. Thank you once more for your presence. Thank you for sharing this time in this space with me. And I very much enjoy the opportunity to talk about these matters which are of import to me, and I hope to you as well. We'll be doing the last of these classes next week, and the final chapter where we're going to be talking about experience and attainment, and we're going to be in a way kind of wrapping it up by looking at how the Buddha did arrive at his conception of truth. And we'll be finishing up with Jatakas' somewhat controversial idea about nibbana. Well, is it controversial or not? Well, we will find that out next week. Anyway, so thank you so much for your attendance, and I look forward to seeing you then. And thank you again to the Buddhist Library for organizing this and putting this on for us.